The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. What an exciting time to be able to do practice and to do effective practice, which we are all doing. It is amazing what that man so long ago discovered, that each one of us is endowed innately with this mind of clarity, wisdom, unimpeded luminosity that he had discovered through his very efforts, the same efforts that we are making now. Today is the 6th day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico in June 2021. It's well known in psychological circles, finally, because the Buddha kind of discovered that many, many centuries ago, that how we live, what we experience in the process of living, impacts our perceptions. We see the world through a filter of our experiences, which include the assumptions that we make as a result of those experiences, the reactivity that we indulge in as a result of those experiences. And for most people, we don't know what to do about it. We don't even know that we're doing it. It's all unconscious. And yet it all adds up to suffering. Life is a combination of moments of pleasure and moments of pain. And the Buddha nailed it when he spoke of the 4 noble paths. But let me share a little bit more from this book, Luminous Mind, The Way of the Buddha, the writings, the teachings of Kalu Rinpoche. This is in a chapter called The 3 Turnings of the Teaching. Mind is eclipsed by many different obscurations. If they're removed, mind's fundamental nature, like the sun shining brightly in the clear open sky, can manifest all the qualities of wisdom, compassion, and a Buddha's abilities. That is our innate, inborn ability. It's only that it's covered up by our misperceptions. Some misperceptions are sort of ordinary, but some of them are so deeply ingrained and so challenging that they drive us in ways that we perpetuate suffering. And yet, through this practice, we have the potential for becoming free of these. The reason why practice is challenging is because as it goes on, we become aware of these obscurations and the pain that they're causing. So if we proceed, if we continue practicing, opening ourselves to the full physical experience of what is going on in moment-to-moment life, it's amazing how free we can become of the very conditioning that we have been exposed to and taken on as we were growing up. Mind is eclipsed by many different obscurations. If they're removed, which we can do through practice. And one of the most effective practices for this is the extended out-breath, coupled with the openness to possibility. If we don't assume that we know automatically, then there's the option to see something new and different and maybe more accurate. Mind's fundamental nature, like the sun shining brightly in the clear sky, can manifest all the qualities of wisdom, compassion, and a Buddha's abilities. Usually, we're prisoners of dualistic fixation that makes us experience many deceptive appearances without being able to recognize their true nature. Seeing this, Buddha Shakyamuni, in his great compassion, taught many methods for becoming free. All of them are skillful means for helping different kinds of beings, accommodating each individual's abilities and needs. And so he taught many, many teachings. They're divided technically into different forms of Buddhism. The Mahayana, which Zen is part of, in which we vow to come to awakening and work towards awakening, not for our own personal benefit, but for the benefit of all beings. And this is out of the universal view of the Buddha, that there is no difference between me and you. Sure, there is clear and obvious differences, but fundamentally, there's no difference. Fundamentally, we are one beingness of the universe. And when we realize this deeply enough, it's very hard to hold anger against anyone else. And the Buddha spoke to this. He said, to be angry at someone is like holding a hot, burning coal in your own hand. It's burning you because we're not separate. A certain amount of scientific investigation has actually confirmed this. When heartbeats are measured, the energy of the heart or the energy of the brain is measured, it can be felt, it can be measured some distance away. In other words, it's not confined to this body. And we have what are known as mirror neurons, which are able to mirror the emotional state of other people. We can feel what other people are feeling. If this were a discrete body, how could that be possible? But it is possible. It's quite common, actually. We walk into a room. If there's anybody angry in a room, it's palpable. There's almost like a feeling of woo. And if we're in the presence of somebody who's deeply compassionate and expressing that compassion, not necessarily in words or form, but one can feel it radiating from that person. We feel it. You've heard so many times of the reason why Mitra-roshi ended up becoming a Zen teacher and a deeply realized a master Zen teacher in the Rinzai sect. And that is because even though he was raised in a temple, a Buddhist temple, and his father was a Buddhist monk, it was what is known as a family temple in Japan, and it wasn't a teaching temple. And so his father did ceremonies of various sorts, including funerals and so on. In fact, in some sectors of Japan, Buddhism has a bad name because, or I should say Buddhist priests have a bad name because they're considered funeral directors. When people want to get married, they go to a Shinto priest when they're ready to get buried, their family goes to a Buddhist priest. And so Buddhism or Buddhist priesthood is connected with death, which is considered a negative situation in Japan, so much that the language even expresses it. The word shi, which literally is four, number four, also is death. And so buildings often do not have a fourth floor or a 14th floor or a 24th floor. It's avoided. When I was at Sogenji, at one time I was it was during a session, and it was at the time when we were not eating in the kitchen where we normally were because the kitchen was being renovated. And so we were eating in the Gohojo, which was part of the original summer home of the daimyo of the area. Centuries before, he had donated it to become a Buddhist monastery for, quote, for the repose of the spirit of his father. And he had invited a priest in, also invited a tea master in, and so there's also a tea school associated with Sogenji that is still extant. And it's a very old, beautiful old building. And of course, it is tatami on the floors, and in the traditional Buddhist temple way, we ate at very low tables, seated seiza on the tatami, which if anybody has ever done that, you know it's rather excruciating. But anyway, that was what we did. And as tenzo of the day, it was my responsibility to answer the telephone if it rang, answer the doorbell if anybody was there, and deal with it. And so in the midst of the dessert course, which was ice cream, it was a summer sesshin, and of course, we don't have spoons to eat ice cream with. We have chopsticks. There I was, the telephone rang, and my chopsticks were full of ice cream. So I, rather than putting them in the traditional position on the table, which would mean the tips would overlook the floor and drip ice cream onto the tatami, which was not really something that one would want to do. It was not really appropriate to lick your chopsticks either. So I stuck them in the ice cream, at which point I got a rather strong reaction. Don't do that. Well, don't do that, because when you're having ceremonies in the temple for the dead, you serve them a meal. And since they can't hold the chopsticks themselves, you insert the chopsticks in the meal and in the bowl. And so it was representing that. And so that says something about this whole idea of death in the Japanese culture. But I've digressed. Ultimately, we will have to die. And how will it be? Our conditioning is driving our living. And the more clearly we can see through that conditioning, become aware of it, and as part of the awareness, it is, if we see through it deeply enough, it lets go. Now, there's some major conditioning that can happen with people, particularly anyone who's been traumatized, and that takes a great deal of work. But it is possible to make big inroads into it and to become ever more clear, which is important, because the more we are caught in our conditioning, and everyone has conditioning, the more we act out of that conditioning, assuming that our view of the world is accurate. But that view of the world is a conditioned view of the world based on our experiences, and is not accurate. The more accurate we can be in our perceptions, the closer we can be to experiencing this luminous clarity, this unimpededness of our fundamental basis of being, the less pain and suffering we will foment, and the less pain and suffering we will experience. It's really a compassionate thing to do, because if we're decreasing our level of reactivity, we're decreasing our level of causing pain and suffering in the world. And the interesting thing about this is, as we begin to realize where we're caught, where our perceptions are misperceptions, and we open more and more to this mind of clarity and wisdom, we find that our experiences change. We are changing, and that influences other people. It is quite amazing. A simple thing of this was Mitra-roshi. When I was in Mexico for an extended period of time during one of his times there, he was starting to write one of his books, and I was his secretary. So we were down there for several months. And every day he would take a walk in the small town that we were living in at the time, and animals were freely roaming. In fact, there was a turkey across the lane from us that caused Roshi to speak of his being in danger of breaking the first precept with regard to that turkey, because constantly it would be going blah, 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 day and night. It was there basically as a watchdog. But one of his walks, he was coming back, and he was down the lane quite a bit. And one of the neighbors said to me, "Please tell the master that not to go near that bull. It's quite dangerous." And there was a bull between Roshi and here, or where I was standing, and it kind of filled the whole lane. So Roshi would have had to get quite close to it to pass by it. And so I called out to Roshi in English and told him that, and he laughed and walked right past the bull with no problem. He loved animals, and his energy was that which caused them to gather to him and to be positive in their relationship with him. So I started out this conversation about death because Mitra-roshi's father, being a priest, mainly did funerals, and the young Mitra wanted nothing to do with that way of life. He saw, as he grew up, that he had characteristics that he really didn't like about himself. And he wanted to become a psychologist because he felt that that was the way to deal with those issues and to resolve them and eliminate them. But then when he was early in his college career in Kyoto, his father asked him to deliver a letter or some papers to a particular temple in Kyoto, in Myoshinji complex. Mitra-roshi was born and raised in Nara. That's where his family temple was. And it's a relatively short train ride to Kyoto, where he was going to college. So he got on a bus early to go to this temple to deliver this sheaf of papers. And as he was on the bus, at one stop, an older man dressed in priest robes got on the bus. And he was deeply quiet in a way that Mitra was entranced by and very interested in, because he was obviously a priest. He was dressed in priest robes, but there was something special about this man. And it turns out they were going to the same place, which was Ryo-en-in, one of the sub-temples of Myoshinji, where Mitra-roshi, who was the man, was the abbot at the time. It just completely changed his life. Being exposed to the deeply present, deeply peaceful demeanor of Mitra-roshi, such that when he finished college, he walked to Shofukuji in Kobe, because by then his teacher was teaching at Shofukuji, and trained there for 20 years and eventually became a Dharma successor of Yamada Mitra-roshi. There are many instances of this. We find ourselves drawn to certain people. It feels good to be around them. We find ourselves uncomfortable around other people. We're sort of innately wary or uncomfortable, we have discomfort. This is coming from the energy that people naturally exude. And that energy comes from the conditioning that they have experienced. Our bodhisattva vow is to come to awakening for the benefit of all beings, to relieve suffering everywhere. And that starts with seeing where we are caught in our own suffering and our own conditioning. And thankfully, this amazing practice makes that possible. It's important to be courageous and walk into it, because it can be frightening, it can be terrifying, actually. It can be extremely challenging, it can be painful. But when we walk into it and let ourselves experience the energies of that experience, we become free. It's not instantaneous, although it is in some cases, but for the deeper, more traumatic experiences we've had, it takes much more time. And yet it is possible. I guarantee it. I've experienced this myself, and it is amazing the level of transformation that you can create within yourself through patient awareness, courage, and a willingness to face what seems to be unfaceable. You don't just jump right in. You go into it to the degree where you can just barely tolerate it. And when it gets to be over the top, you back out. But then you go back in again. And it makes all the difference in the world. As somebody said so long ago, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. So let's continue with this. All three of the yanas, which are the Theravada, which is sometimes called the Hinayana, or the smaller vehicle, the Mahayana, which is called the greater vehicle, or the Vajrayana, since we're in a Tibetan practice teaching book. All three yanas, or vehicles, allow for the complete elimination of the feeling of existing apart as an individual, as well as our usual experience of attachment to things as permanent, which is to say, all the fixations of subject-object grasping. Given the reality of suffering, in order to help beings, Buddha Shakyamuni, in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, explained the Four Noble Truths, which are the following. The noble truth of suffering, or life consists of suffering and limitations. One contemporary teacher called it, because it's a translation of dukkha, and dukkha can mean anything from pervasive dissatisfaction, which is what that teacher called it, to outright extreme suffering. So it's not necessarily that everyone is in severe pain all the time in life. Many of us have moments, days, years, months, where things seem really wonderful. But things change. We lose people that mean a lot to us, and there's pain there. We get sick, and all of a sudden we can't do what we wanted to do, or we develop pains in certain parts of our body, and we eventually get old if we live long enough, and we see the deterioration of the bodily form, wrinkles, bad eyesight, gray hair, greater difficulty moving around, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, ultimately we die. And even birth entails suffering. When you consider the birth process, whether it's a natural birth in which the infant comes through the birth canal, which is quite narrow, and in the process deforms the head of the baby, and can be a long process. I know someone for whom it was 60 hours of giving birth to her first child. 60 hours of pain for infant and mom. Even if it's C-section, there's pain there. And there is the sudden yanking out of the infant from what was a warm, supportive cocoon, hopefully. There are things that happen in birth. I have another friend who went into, it's called eclampsia, and almost died giving birth to the baby. And there's danger to the mother and the child. Women die in birth all over the world, and babies die in birth as well. I have another friend who there was some deformation of the umbilical cord, and when the baby full term dropped into the birth canal, it pressed against that weak spot in the umbilical cord, and the baby died before it was ever born. Many things happen. We are so fortunate to have become alive, to have been born, and moreover, to have encountered the Dharma and had the inclination to practice it, because this makes enormous difference. This is our avenue to freedom. And it's a challenging avenue. For some of it's slogging through quite the swamp full of alligators, poisonous snakes, all kinds of things. For others, it's a little bit more of an easy path. But all of us have to face something. And most of us have to face many things of some level or another. And yet we can become free in facing them. This is something to really recognize. Early in practice, at a certain point, we begin to realize that we're seeing some things that are not comfortable. And initially we can assume that we're becoming worse people because of the practice. That's not the case. Practice is working. We're beginning to shed the scales from our eyes and seeing more clearly our own behavior. And that, while painful, can be ultimately liberating, because usually we don't want to behave in the way that is being shown to us. The second noble truth, the cause of suffering, which is ignorance of the nature of mind and its afflictions. And this is why we can become free, because the practice opens us to the nature of mind and to where we're caught. Then the third, the noble truth of cessation, which is the end of all suffering by reaching enlightenment. And then the fourth noble truth is the path, spelling out exactly how to do this important, vital work. These four noble truths form the first approach to Dharma. The origin of suffering is in the attitudes that disturb the mind. The origin of suffering is in the attitudes that disturb the mind. So after the Buddha Shakyamuni turned the wheel of Dharma a second time, giving the teachings on emptiness, the indefinable nature of ultimate reality. At this point, he taught that all phenomena lack inherent existence. They do not exist independent of causes. There's your conditioning. Things happen, we draw conclusions about them, and they drive our behavior after that, consciously or unconsciously. Rather, they are projections of mind whose nature is similar to space. And this is fantastic news. Because if they are illusions, we can, in opening our mind to increasingly clear seeing, can dispel those illusions and become free. And that, in a nutshell, is practice. So what an adventure it is. And what amazing positive potential it has. Early in Zen in America, people assumed that it was about becoming really cool and let go and free, but free in the sense of license, not free in the sense of true freedom, which would allow the ability to not be caught by circumstances, no matter how negative they are. And here we think about Jacques Lucéran, imprisoned in Buchenwald and dying because after 5 months, his body simply couldn't take the level of starvation, the level of stress by the constant threat of death, and simply the environment. And so he was dying. But in the process of dying, just as Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche writes he did, when he himself was dying in India during his 5 years of pilgrimage, he got severe, stomach problems. He got food poisoning and ended up severely ill and literally dying. And he and Jacques Lucéran also tuned in so completely to the process, the bodily experience of the process of dying, that they both became liberated. In the case of Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, if you've read the book In Love with the World, the monk's travels through the burrows of living and dying, you know that he was rescued, basically woke up in a hospital on an IV drip with antibiotics and so on, and was able to recover, but not before he reached a point of almost no return in terms of his dying. As far as Jacques Lucéran, he had been carried away to what they euphemistically called the hospital, which was just a bare piece of concrete outdoors, where they laid people so that they could die instead of in the midst of an enormous crowd of prisoners. They could die with some space around them. And he tuned in so completely that he recovered from these very, very serious illnesses. I recently asked a doctor friend of mine about something he knew exactly what his body was doing. And there were 3 doctors that I actually diagnosed him. They were prisoners like he in the camp. And one of the things was his face got all swollen up with what it's called erysipelas. And when I asked a doctor friend about that, he said it's an extremely serious condition. Yet Jacques Lasserre survived. And as a part of that process, he came to a deep awakening experience, just as Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche said, through the same process, really. When we let go of who we think we are, who we think we have to be, it's amazing what can happen. And these 2 men expressed it. They experienced it. And after that, no one stole his food at Buchenwald. And as you've heard so many times, instead they would wake him up in the middle of the night and lead him, because he was blind, to people who were freaking out, because his very profound peace in the midst of that horrid place was enough to calm people down. And here again, we've got mirror neurons at work. On top of that, he wrote that he found joy. He found joy in the midst of hell, not from going nuts, but because he opened to letting go of who he thought he needed to be, what he thought he needed to have in order to exist safely or exist at all. And as a result, the joy of the freedom stayed with him for the rest of his life. This is our potential as well. The reason why enlightenment has such a hype is because the moment of experiencing at least a glimpse of the truth is joyful. The feeling of freedom from our stuff is palpable. Of course, then there's a long avenue of having to work to really reinforce that and see increasingly where we're caught and increasingly let go. It's a lifetime's process, but how amazing to be able to encounter it and practice it even now. It's miraculous. And everyone has the capacity to succeed in this work. Determination, openness to possibility, faith that you can, and then just keep on doing it. Just keep on working. The practice is liberating. It's not liberating in the way that the early Zen folks in America thought. It's liberating in a far deeper, far more profound, far more effective way. It's not about license, it's about true liberation, so that even like Jacques Lasserre, if you're in Buchenwald in a prison camp where torture and extermination is rampant and starvation is the way people are also slowly killed, along with terror, to be able to be free in the midst of that, to experience joy. This is our birthright for all of us. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.